What if I told you that the Squid Game was real? That before the series ever shocked the world, something similar happened in real life. A government-supported labor and detention facility targeted street dwellers, many of whom were not homeless, under Chun Doo-hwan's social purification campaign ahead of the 1988 Olympics. An estimated 16,000 to 20,000 people were detained, including children, disabled individuals, and political dissidents. Inmates were forcibly rounded up, often by police or private agents, from public spaces. Systematic beatings, torture, rape, and severe punishments were widespread. At least 657 inmate deaths were confirmed, many buried anonymously or donated to medical schools without family notification. In this video, we are going to reveal the real story of Squid Game. Year 2008. The world was crumbling under the weight of a financial crisis. Banks were collapsing, jobs were disappearing, and in a small apartment in Seoul, South Korea, a man sat staring at his computer screen, broke, frustrated, and barely able to afford dinner. That man was Hwang Dong-hyuk, and he had no idea that the pain he was living through would one day become the biggest show in the history of Netflix. When Hwang Dong-hyuk began writing the earliest version of Squid Game, he wasn't chasing fame. He was barely hanging on. His bank account was empty. His bills were piling up. His dreams, once bright, now flickered under the weight of rejection and real-world despair. He had no job, no prospects. He even sold his laptop, his only writing tool, just to feed his family. In those days, Hwang would spend hours in comic cafes, not for fun, for heat, for free internet. And there, surrounded by the buzzing noise of cheap monitors and vending machines, he started rereading some of his favorite Japanese survival manga. Battle Royale, Kaiji, Liar Game. Stories where desperate people competed in twisted games for money. And that's when something clicked. He realized this wasn't fiction anymore. This was his life. And millions of others were living the same nightmare. A world where the poor fight each other to survive, while the rich watch from above, entertained and untouchable. He called it Round 6. The name Round 6 was a reference to the 6 childhood games the characters would play throughout the story. It had a very direct, structured meaning. Each round eliminated players, just like a tournament. It also represented how life under capitalism feels like an endless series of exhausting rounds where you either advance or get discarded. You see, the genius of Squid Game isn't just that it imagined a deadly competition, it's that it remembered one. Long before Hwang Dong-hyuk put pen to paper, South Korea had already played a version of the game in real life. It didn't have masked guards or prize money, but it had players, it had violence, and it had silence. A silence that lasted for decades. They called it Brothers Home, a name that sounds like a shelter, but behind its gates, it was closer to a prison camp. It begins in Busan, at a place deceptively called Brothers Home. Founded in 1976 and operating until 1987, it was presented as an orphanage, a welfare center, a shelter for society's vulnerable. But inside those walls, it was nothing less than a prison camp, protected by institutional lies and fueled by state policy. Under South Korea's military dictatorship, especially during Chun Doo-hwan's regime, a campaign of social purification swept through the country in the lead-up to the 1988 Seoul Olympics. It was a campaign meant to clean the streets, not of crime, but of people. Vague, brutal classifications like vagrant or undesirable allowed authorities to round up thousands. Children playing outside, disabled people, sex workers, homeless men, or even dissidents who had angered the regime. All were forcibly taken, often without records, and dumped into facilities like Brothers Home. The numbers are staggering. Between 16,000 to 20,000 people were detained, often by police or private bounty hunters hired to clear the streets. Some were never heard from again. But the real horror began after detention. Inside Brothers Home, inmates, including children, were forced into labor. They worked in on-site factories, producing pens, brooms, clothing, and more. Others were sent off-site to farms, construction zones, or corporate facilities, where their labor earned profit not for them, but for the institution. Wages were withheld, conditions were inhumane, and those who disobeyed were punished. Torture was routine. Beatings were systematic. Rape was reported. Solitary confinement was weaponized. These were not isolated cases. They were the norm. The cost in human life was devastating. At least 657 deaths were documented, though many more are suspected. Victims were buried in unmarked graves, or in some cases, their bodies were donated to medical schools without the family's knowledge. 9-year-old Han Jong-seon is one of the most documented child victims, kidnapped from the street, beaten, and traumatized for years. Other survivors would later reveal that children were secretly sold for overseas adoption. At least 19 confirmed cases, with many more suspected. And this didn't happen in the shadows. The government knew. Brothers Home was given state subsidies based on the number of inmates held, which incentivized mass detention. The more bodies, the more money. It wasn't until 1987, after a raid by prosecutors, prosecutors that the abuse was exposed to the public. Even then, only a handful of officials faced prison time, and for only a few years. The rest walked free. For decades, survivors were ignored. Records were buried. No one wanted to remember. It wasn't until 2020 to 2022, over 3 decades later, that South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission reopened the case and formally labeled it what it was, state-sponsored atrocity. But even then, no new criminal convictions followed. No full justice, just another layer of silence. And Brothers Home wasn't alone. In 1980, right after the Gwangju uprising, the regime established a parallel system called the Samcheong re-education camps. Their purpose was brutally clear: suppress dissent by any means. Over 60,000 to 100,000 civilians were swept into these camps. Protesters, students, workers, or anyone who opposed the military dictatorship. There were no trials, no appeals, just blacklists and arrests. Inside, the Samcheong camps mimicked military boot camps crossed with labor prisons. Inmates were assigned into tiers, A to D, with punishments growing harsher as their threat level increased. Forced labor was mandatory. Beatings were constant. At least 339 people died, not from war or combat, but from neglect, torture, and untreated injuries. Others were released years later, broken in body and mind, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. This is the world that Squid Game comes from, not just creatively, but spiritually. When Hwang Dong-hyuk wrote about players forced into violence for the entertainment of the powerful, he was channeling a deeper truth. This has all happened before, under flags, uniforms, and silence. And maybe that's why the show hit so hard, because for some, Squid Game wasn't fiction. It was history, painted in pink jumpsuits. In 2016, Netflix saw the global rise of Korean culture and made a bold move. They launched in South Korea and began investing in K-dramas. But they didn't stop there. A few years later, they doubled down, pouring in nearly $500 million and even building 2 production facilities near Seoul. Why? Because Korean stories weren't just local anymore. They were taking over the world. And finally, in 2019, after being rejected by studios for over a decade, Netflix bought the rights to the script. 2 years later, they released it under a new name, Squid Game. The result? A global phenomenon. In just 17 days, Squid Game reached over 110 million households, becoming the most watched series in Netflix history. It generated nearly $1 billion in value for the platform. And now, with Season 3 streaming, that number could easily be surpassed, making Squid Game one of the most valuable shows Netflix has ever created. So yes, Round 6 was the original working title for what would later become the phenomenon known as Squid Game. So now, as millions around the world press play on Squid Game Season 3, cheering, theorizing, binge-watching, it's worth remembering this: the real game never had a winner. There was no cash prize, no golden card, only survivors and silence. Hwang Dong-hyuk didn't just write a thriller. He held up a mirror. He showed us a version of society where the poor are disposable, the powerful are entertained, and the system is rigged from the start. Sound like fiction? Maybe? But it also sounds a lot like what happened in Brothers Home and in Samcheong, where people were stolen, punished, erased, all in the name of order, all under the illusion of help. And maybe that's why Squid Game works. Because deep down, it's not just about Korea. It's about every system that treats human lives as numbers, about every forgotten voice screaming in silence, about how easy it is to look away until someone turns it into a story too powerful to ignore. This isn't just a show about games. It's a story about survival, about the cost of poverty, about the pain of being invisible in a world that only sees value and profit. So the next time you see a player in that green tracksuit, remember, for many, that uniform wasn't fiction, it was history. And maybe, just maybe, this time the world is finally watching.